Today, we are honored to have Professor Kristen, a distinguished scholar in the fields of Asian studies and Chinese politics. She currently serves as an associate professor of Asian studies and government at Georgetown University in the United States. Having served as a Wilson China Fellow from 2022 to 2023, she is also participating in the Public Intellectuals program of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations for the 2023 to 2025 term. Today, we will conduct an interview with Professor Kristen and look forward to hearing her insights. During your interactions with Chinese young scholars, was there a moment that made you feel the ideas of young people from both countries are surprisingly similar?
Most of my interactions with young scholars from China in recent years have been at Georgetown University, where I teach master's students and I teach master's students and I teach PhD students from China. And I also teach courses on Chinese politics that attract Chinese students. And I find that even though our two political systems are incredibly different, that there are a lot of commonalities between Chinese and US students. For example, both countries are dealing with some of the same challenges, especially economic challenges, and students from both places have concerns that are really similar to each other, such as what job am I going to get after I graduate? Why has it become so difficult to get into graduate programs such as law schools or PhD programs? How am I going to repay my student loans? That may be something that's of less concern to Chinese students here in China, but Chinese students who are overseas, of course, are also worried about the high cost of higher education and the ability to recuperate that cost as a young professional. So I think that actually young people everywhere are struggling with an uncertain economy, and people have lived through a lot of uncertain times in the last 10 years or so, including the pandemic, which greatly affected this generation of young people, and I think led to similar practical, economic, and health concerns. But there is also a kind of, we have to live for today and make the most out of life attitude that I think young Chinese and young Americans have too, which comes from experiencing a kind of collective trauma like the pandemic, this realization that you only have one life. And so despite all the stresses going on in the world, you also have to find ways of enjoying it. So I think maybe it's because our countries and the world is so interconnected now. Despite a few years of not being able to travel to China or the US and vice versa, the challenges that we've experienced as human beings is quite similar. And so the generational attitudes about the future are similar too.
When chatting with Chinese young scholars about life and growth in your respective familiar ways, was there a small detail that made you feel cross-cultural communication can be very warm and approachable?
I've always found cross-cultural communication with young Chinese to be rewarding and positive and fun. From my first experience in China, I came here in 1999 as a student. I was studying abroad at Hagongda in northeastern China, Harbin Institute of Technology, and I found the Chinese personalities to be very warm and open and full of kind of fun and generosity and laughter. And in some ways a little bit like Americans, more so than Europeans or Japanese or something like that, which as a broad generalization are kind of more reserved culturally. I don't think of Chinese as being culturally reserved. I don't think of Americans as being culturally reserved, meaning not open to talking to strangers, right? But rather actually quite open to talking to strangers. So I would say there's not a specific moment that made me feel like cross-cultural communication was especially positive, but just in general, after many decades of interacting with young Chinese people, first in the capacity of a student, and then later as a researcher, and now as a professor, I've always found it to be quite positive, even when there are strong differences of opinion as well. I think that people in general just kind of love to talk and share their opinion, and that's something that Americans and Chinese have in common.
After communicating with Chinese young scholars, what new discoveries have you made about their hobbies outside of work, such as their favorite books, movies, or sports?
So I'm culturally out of touch because I'm old now. I'm 47 years old, so I don't know what the popular activities and books and media and things like that are today. But I do think that back then, the main things I found were people who, similar to me, also loved exercise. I see that in Beijing right now too, with an increase in the number of runners and bikers and people who are engaged in rock climbing and other activities. You can see it on the streets, in the parks. There's a lot. It's a very active society right now. In terms of like what young people are reading, I would say that actually like my American students at Georgetown could probably give me a first-class education in what's popular and specifically what things from China are popular. I remember my students talking about the Ne Zha movies also talking about things that they've seen, Chinese adaptations, the three-body problem, for example, adaptations of like Chinese novels to American media. And because they're also on TikTok, and many of them, when TikTok was temporarily shut down, went to Xiaohongshu, Red Note, I think that a lot of young people in the United States actually know more about current trends in Chinese culture and young people's interests than older Americans do, for sure. Again, because this is the internet age and things are globally connected.
If you had to describe your overall feeling of communicating with Chinese young scholars and students in one word or sentence, what would you choose? Is there a short story behind it that you can share?
I would say one word. That's hard. That's a hard question that you asked me. How would I describe it in one word? I would say people here, and my impression of people here, young people here, is that they are open-minded despite having access to a totally different information environment than I do or than other people do. So let me give you an example. You asked for an example. This is from many years ago, but I previously did debate when I was in high school, 辩论队, right? This was a fun activity for me. I also coached debate when I was in college and for a little bit as a professional when I was working in my mid-20s. And from that, when I was in China, I got to know some people who were organizing 辩论比赛 here, like debate tournaments. And I remember teaching or coaching at a tournament at Renda. I'm pointing that way because it was over there. I had this really, really interesting conversation and I was persuaded by their point of view. But they were also open-minded to my point of view as well. And so I think this was an interesting just example of interacting with people who are operating in a different information environment and from a different kind of historical, cultural, political background than me, but also finding space to have a conversation where understanding was reached. So that's why I think it's interesting, that story, because it just reminds me of something, an opportunity that came from what should have been an obvious point of disagreement ended up being a lot kind of blurrier.